you can see some really interesting patterns across cultures. So this one study that was actually done by our old friend David Buss looked at early experiences that people would have in China and in Sweden. And so the reason he chose these two is that they are fairly different cultures in a lot of ways. So in China, marriages tend to last a very long time, and divorce is pretty rare, particularly compared to Sweden and the United States. So, bless you. Incidentally, divorce used to be much more difficult, but I think in 2003 they actually changed the laws so it was easier for people to get divorced. Before they had to go through this big, complicated procedure. But even after that change, divorce is still much more rare in China than it is elsewhere. So it's about a 20% divorce rate. Over there, in China, parents typically invest pretty heavily in their children. Now, probably part of the reason for this is there are government restrictions that prevent people from having over a certain number of children, and they're pretty strict about that. And there's also a very high value that tends to be placed on chastity and virginity. Now, Sweden, by comparison, has a higher divorce rate, so it's much closer to the rate that you see in America. Over here, it's about 50%. There, it's just a little bit higher, like 53.9%. There tend to be more children born outside of marriage in Sweden compared to in China. And there also tend to be fewer fathers who invest in those children. And so coming from the evolutionary perspective, I'm really tempted to say, well, what's going on here is most likely something that we refer to as paternal uncertainty. So men have these genetic predispositions to be careful about where they invest their resources. And so if they think that it's likely that a child may not be theirs, then they're going to invest less. This is why, generally speaking, mothers tend to invest more in children than fathers. Because mothers are 100% certain, I gave birth to this kid, it's got my genes. Whereas men, even if they have the most faithful partner in the world, are not as certain as the mothers. Right? So, also, compared to China, in Sweden there tends to be a much lower value placed on chastity and virginity. So it isn't viewed as being the end-all, be-all of your self-worth, like it often is in China. So, any questions about this type of study? So the basic idea here, just to kind of tie this all together, is that children, as they're growing up in these cultures, have very different types of experiences. So over here in Sweden, they might be born, they're more likely to be born outside of marriage and less likely to have a strong father figure who's investing a lot in them compared to in China. And so that could lead them to develop more of a short-term sexual strategy and place less value on chastity and virginity. Whereas in China, you just see the flip side of this, and that results in a very different perspective on the value of chastity and virginity. Okay. So, let's see. The last topic we'll cover today is one that I find really interesting because I've grown up in the South. I was born in Michigan, but I spent my whole life in the South. And so there's this whole concept that we'll talk about today called the culture of honor that looks at why Southerners respond in distinct ways to insults to their personal honor. So the researchers who examined this, Nisbet and Cohen, started off with this fundamental question, asking, well, are white Southern men actually more aggressive than other men when responding to insults. So this is one of those things that it might be commonly accepted. So it's almost a stereotype, but psychologists hadn't actually examined to see if there's any fact behind it. So they set up some interesting studies in which they had participants come into the lab, and then an experimenter insulted them. Now, they had a pretty clever way of doing this. Now, it wasn't just like you go to the study and you realize that that this person is the experimenter and they call you a jerk. What they did was they had the person go to the first part of the experiment and say, fill out some personality questionnaires, and then they were told, all right, now we need you to walk to this other room down the hall to complete the second part of the experiment. And so the participant would get up, walk down the hall. Now there's a confederate, a person working with the experimenter, who's also in the hall, and they bump into the participant intentionally while the person is walking from point A to point B. And then when that happens, the confederate insults the person and says, hey, watch where you're going, asshole. And then they look at how the participant's behavior is affected by this manipulation. Right? And so here's what they found. So compared to participants from the north, southern participants believed that the insult made them appear weaker. So and they were more upset by this incident, more offended. Oh yeah. Compared to the northerners, the southern participants believed that it made them appear weaker and were more upset. And they also responded with more aggressive types of behaviors and more dominant behaviors in a number of different experimental tasks that they were given. So, for example, they completed word stems with more aggressive, violent types of words. So, you've seen some word stems in here before, but just to illustrate, so you give the participants something like this. So, blank UNCH, and just say, all right, complete this word. Yeah, and so the Southerners, after being insulted, were more likely to complete this with punch. Whereas other people, they could complete this in a variety of ways. You could make it lunch, you could make it hunch. So that's an example of a word stem. Let's see. They also completed these vignettes differently. So a vignette is just a little sample story that people would be exposed to in an experiment. So, for example, they would read about a scenario in which the main character is at a crowded party, and then some other man comes up and attempts to kiss his long-term romantic partner. And the participant has to indicate what is the best course of action for this main character. So the southern participants who had been insulted were more likely to say, well, he should go up and punch that guy in the face. So they also had a stronger, more dominant handshake. So when they got to where they were going in the second part of the experiment, they were greeted and they had a strong, really firm handshake. And there have been other measures too. So one that I thought was particularly interesting was you see a bigger increase in testosterone among these folks after receiving an insult. So that goes along with a lot of the things that we've said about the role of testosterone in human psychology. So the phenomenon has been clearly demonstrated, but the question remains, why? Why do southern participants react differently than northern participants? So the explanation that Nisbet and colleagues used is called the culture of honor hypothesis. So the idea here is that in certain cultures, insults are viewed as public challenges. and that if you are to maintain your honor or dignity, you have to respond to a public challenge like an insult with direct confrontation and possibly physical aggression. So these people are really concerned with reputation. But that's an interesting explanation, but it's still what we would call a proximate explanation. So it doesn't get to the underlying root of why this would have developed within a specific culture. And sure enough, Nisbet and Cohen have an explanation for this too. So the theory that they put forth is that this culture of honor, that aspect, is more likely to develop in cultures that either have a herding-based economy, or at least historically they have had a herding economy, as opposed to other types of agriculture like growing plants like corn and wheat, tobacco. So the notion here is that in that type of an economy, someone's resources are more subject to theft. So it's easier to steal a herd of cows or sheep than it is to steal a field of wheat. And maintaining a dominant reputation is going to be important if you want to protect your resources. So if people know that you're a badass, they're less likely to come up and try to mess with you by taking your stuff. And so that is the ultimate level explanation that they've put forth. And it's a pretty compelling explanation. You do see the same type of pattern in other herding economies in other cultures. So I think there's probably something to this. Of course, there's another factor in our own culture when it comes to explaining hostility in the South, and that is this positive correlation between heat and aggression. So this is a pretty well demonstrated psychological phenomenon on its own, that when it's hot out, people are more irritable. And this has been demonstrated with a wide range of data. The homicide rate tends to go up in the summer. During hotter games, baseball games, the pitcher is more likely to hit the batter with the ball to bean them. And I had a friend who, a couple of years back, he thought that you could explain the success of the troop surge in Iraq in terms of the ambient temperature at that time of year. I can't remember if he was successful in that or not, but it's an interesting idea. So, kind of tying this all back together into the perspective of this being evoked potential, we can understand this along the lines of the fact that all humans have the potential to be sensitive to public insults. So it's just part of human nature that we can develop that particular sensitivity. But, and they can also respond violently to those insults. So we all have the potential to do this. But that potential is only evoked or triggered in certain cultures. Specifically, according to Nisbet and Cohen, cultures that have a herding economy or a history of having a herding economy. And so in other cultures that have a different type of economy, that potential is still there, but it's just dormant. So the switch hasn't been flipped on in other people.